Welcome to part 2 of my video covering the so-called Witchcraft Murder of 1945. I left off in part 1 speaking about the myths and folklore tales surrounding Warwickshire and how they have been linked to the death of Charles Walton. I'll continue on that subject and open part 2 with one of the best known folklore tales in the area and how it, albeit briefly, became entwined in the Witchcraft Murder. In the wake of Charles Walton's death, rumours circulated that a black dog had been seen in the area around the time of his murder. This is an age-old story in the area and concerns a number of tales about black hellhounds appearing as omens of impending death. Even Robert Fabian, the famed Scotland Yard detective at the helm of the case, said that he had seen a black dog during the investigation whilst walking the fields of Meon Hill and contemplating the apparently impossible task ahead of him. It is said that after seeing the dog, he met a young boy who looked lost, or as if he were searching for something. Fabian stopped and asked the young boy if he was looking for a black dog. The boy suddenly looked frightened at Fabian's description of the animal and ran away. The most well-known black dog case is one that appeared in a book by J. Harvey Bloom entitled Folklore, Old Customs and Superstitions in Shakespeareland, first published in 1929. The story goes that in 1885 a young farm worker by the name of Charles Walton had seen a black dog in the fields of Warwickshire on 3 consecutive nights. The young man would then discover on the 3rd night that his sister had died. It's not widely believed that the Charles Walton in this story is the same Charles Walton that died in 1945. But the dates do add up, as a 74-year-old Charles Walton of 1945 would have been 15 at the time the story was set. However, the murdered Charles Walton didn't have a sister who died in 1885, so it's often disregarded as mere coincidence. Robert Fabian has come under fire in recent years due to the inconsistencies and exaggerations in his book, Fabian of the Yard. He said of the Charles Walton case that Walton had in fact been killed in a reproduction of a Druid ceremony close to the famous Druid circle of the Whispering Knights. Author Gerald B. Gardner contested these claims in his book, The Meaning of Witchcraft. He said the Whispering Knights are not a stone circle. They are not close to where Walton was murdered. In fact, they lie about 12 miles away, and they are not from the time of the Druids. He also said that no one knows for sure what the Druid ceremonies entailed, so it was impossible to say for sure if his murder was a reproduction of one. Some believe that Fabian's writing were exaggerated for sheer sensationalism. In 1945, following his claim that the local people of Lower Quinton shunned him in one big witchcraft-related conspiracy, he said, "The natives of Upper and Lower Quinton and the surrounding district are of a secretive disposition, and they do not take easily to strangers." The truth may have been a lot more simple than that. It may have been that the local population simply didn't have any information to give, rather than something to hide. The fact that Fabian spent several weeks trying to solve the case to no avail must have frustrated him, and maybe, in his eyes at least, tainted his good reputation. So to say that he was conspired against would have helped his personal case. According to some sources, about 500 people from Lower Quinton gave statements, so the Wall of Silence claim may have well been an exaggeration. Although at the time Fabian stayed steadfast in his belief that witchcraft was not at hand, 25 years later he stated in his book The Anatomy of Crime, "I advise anybody who is tempted at any time to venture into black magic, witchcraft, shamanism, call it what you will, to remember Charles Walton and to think of his death, which was clearly the ghastly climax of pagan rite. There is no stronger argument to keep us as far away as possible from the villains with their swords, incense and mumbo-jumbo. It's prudence on which your future peace of mind and even your life could depend." Judging by the words of an older and possibly wiser Robert Fabian, Maybe he had become a believer after all. Long after Fabian and his assistant Albert Webb had returned to Scotland Yard empty-handed, Detective Superintendent Alex Spooner continued to search for the murderer in earnest. The case of Charles Walton fascinated him so much that he continued to return to the village on the anniversary of his murder, long after the rest of the world had concluded that the perpetrator would never be found. In 1950, Lower Quinton was graced with the maverick efforts of Margaret Murray. The anthropologist, Egyptologist, and author of The Witch Cult in Western Europe undertook her own investigation and said that she was almost satisfied that it was a witchcraft-related murder. The 87-year-old professor disguised herself as a visiting artist and spent a week in the area. Ultimately, though, she did not shed any further light onto the case. In 1952, a séance was held on Meon Hill in the hope of accomplishing some clarity through the spirit world on the 7-year-old mystery. A psychic researcher by the name of Mr. H.R. Mills and a medium from Birmingham by the name of Mrs. Higginbotham claimed to have spoken to a spirit by the name of Walton. They said that the spirit spoke to them and exclaimed, "I forgive. I deserved what was coming to me, but not in such a brutal way." It's also said that in 1960, Charles Walton's pocket watch turned up in an outhouse of his cottage, despite an extensive search by police at the time of the murder. A murder which remains unsolved to this day. In 2014, a journalist by the name of Faye, reporting for the Coventry and Warwickshire section of the BBC News website, paid a visit to Lower Quinton. If the wall of silence claimed by Robert Fabian in 1945 were as true as he claimed, then astonishingly, the modern people of Lower Quinton were just as reluctant to speak on the subject. When asked about the case, a woman by the name of Joyce, who worked in the village post office, told the reporter, "No one will talk to you about it. There are none of the Walton family left here now. I have no answers to your questions." The landlord of the College Arms, Tony Smith, told her, "I can't talk to you about that. After 17 years of running this place, I know there are some things we don't talk about. There are no relatives of Charles Walton left in the village, and people that might have known what happened are all dead and gone." In a curious contradiction to his last statement, he went on to say, "In cases like this, there's always someone that knows something. Someone knows what happened, but for the sake of relatives and for not upsetting people, no one will say." The previous landlord made the mistake of taking the legend lightly when he told customers of his plans to hang witches from the ceilings of his pub. The local feeling against these plans was so strong that he abandoned the idea. Charles Walton's grave was supposedly destroyed by a relative who was tired of the media attention and constant visits by strangers to the grave. The graveyard in Lower Quinton holds few headstones, but among them there is one, small and sunken in stature, that has the inscribed initials CHW. Now I don't know what Charles Walton's middle name was, but is this the remains of a headstone marking the final resting place of a man murdered for witchcraft, or was his death simply the result of a financial dispute?